On this episode of WarDocs, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel PA Stephen M. DeLellis shares his remarkable journey through military medicine, detailing his transition from an enlisted soldier to a physician assistant. He reflects on pivotal moments in his career, including his experiences in combat, the evolution of military medicine, and the significant lessons learned from the Battle of Mogadishu. Steve discusses his extensive experience with TC3 and covers innovative approaches to assessing and treating traumatic brain injuries, as well as his work with the Fort Liberty Research Institute. Steve's insights reflect a deep commitment to supporting warfighters and improving medical practices within the military community. For further information about PA DeLellis and our previous guests, visit our website at wardocspodcast.com. Be sure to follow WarDocs on your preferred podcast platform and subscribe to our WarDocs YouTube channel. I'm your host, Dr. Doug Soderdahl, retired Army urologist.
Welcome to WarDocs, the military medicine podcast. This show brings you a first-hand, behind-the-scenes look into the mission, unique opportunities, and deployed experiences of the entire military healthcare team. From state-of-the-art hospitals in the United States to the most austere environments across the globe, WarDocs has you covered.
Today, we're privileged to welcome retired Army Lieutenant Colonel PA Stephen DeLellis to WarDocs. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Doug. Great to be here.
So you have an amazing career in military medicine. How about you tell us a little bit about how that journey began, starting from your days as a private in 1983?
Yeah, boy, this is a journey I never expected to be on. Winter of 1982, I had been out of high school a couple of years, started my college career, got pretty well focused on at least a path toward medical school, was doing pre-med studies, had gone out and visited a couple medical schools and realized this is really what I wanted to do. But unlike most kids in my senior year of high school, my folks moved away from home when I was a senior. So I actually didn't have parents. I tell people my parents moved away from home my senior year of high school. My brother was a freshman in college. My folks had moved from where we grew up in Louisville, Kentucky to Houston, Texas. And I was pretty well set on going to University of Louisville, U of L with my brother. So we stayed. We got an apartment, and I did my first couple of years of college and really got focused in my pre-medical studies and realized that working and going to school full time just wasn't going to cut it if I wanted to save enough money to go to medical school. So I was one of those odd ducks back in the early 80s that actually joined the Army for college money. I joined the Army in winter of 1983. A year later, I ended up heading off to Fort Benning and doing an infantry basic training. I'd actually joined the Army as unassigned special forces. I had a couple relatives that and friends that had been in the special forces, and I figured that was a pretty exciting way to go and spend a couple of years getting some college money and having a little fun doing it. When I got to basic training, one of our drill sergeants suggested that those of us that were going unassigned special forces go to the Ranger Regiment instead. Well, actually, there was no Ranger Regiment at the time. Join the Rangers instead of going SF. He was a Ranger in Vietnam, and he said, it's really a much better place for a young soldier to kind of learn soldiering. I cannot be more appreciative of the path that drill sergeant had put me and the other folks in my basic training cohort on, because that was probably the best recommendation that anyone had ever made for me during my career. The Ranger Battalion at the time was an absolutely fabulous place to grow up as a private and learn soldiering. So I did some time in the Ranger Battalion and really learned the art of soldiering as probably a little bit older than most privates at the time. I had not graduated from college, so I didn't have any additional rank. But I learned that there was a whole lot more to the special operations community than what I had previously understood to be special forces and then the Rangers. And so I spent about 5 years in the 1st Ranger Battalion learning the art of soldiering. I had some great mentors. Along the way, the Ranger Regiment was formed, so I learned a little bit about military heraldry and the importance of lineage in military units, and there was a lot of esprit de corps in the unit at the time, and that really meant something to me. There was a bond between the young Rangers and the non-commissioned officers that we were all growing up with that really helped me focus on what I thought would be the next just couple of years in the Army. Um, and before I knew it, I had been in the 1st Ranger Battalion for about 5 years before I kind of stepped back and thought, geez, I've been here a little bit longer than I anticipated. And I thought about getting out and going back to college, but in the meantime, everyone in my chain of command had gone and tried out for a special operations unit here at Fort Bragg. My team leader, my squad leader, my platoon sergeant, they had all left one by one to go to this selection course for this unit here at Fort Bragg. So, in my mind, as a young Ranger, that's what you did when you got to a certain point in your career. And I made rank very fast in the 1st Ranger Battalion. I'm 85 in 2 years. I went to Ranger School very early in my time there. When you graduate from Ranger School in the 1st Ranger Battalion, you're automatically promoted to E4, a specialist. But I was promoted to corporal, given a leadership role. Then almost a year, just briefly a year later, an E5, and just a couple years later, E6. So before I had left the 1st Ranger Battalion, 5 years in the Army, I was already a staff sergeant. So I went to the selection course because that's what everyone else did, and it seemed to be the natural path.
Yeah. So when you were early with the Rangers, did you kind of think about going away from the pathway of medicine, or was that always kind of just in the back of your mind?
Never did. So a guy by the name of Bill Donovan, Doc Donovan, was our PA in the 1st Ranger Battalion. We had some stellar medics, and the medics were very engaged with the Rangers. We had a very comprehensive first aid training program, and I really got into learning, the things that the medics were doing and the first responders were doing. I had an opportunity to take some courses at one of the community colleges, emergency medical technician courses, and all with the help of Doc Donovan and our senior medics. So I'd kind of kept engaged in the medical arena, even though I was an infantryman. But we had first responders and tactical, combat casualty care lifesavers. Combat lifesavers is what they were called at the time. So I always had an aid bag in my rucksack. And it was a really unique time in the military. Grenada had just happened, and we were kind of at a lull where I had this opportunity to grow up in really a relatively peaceful time for our Army. So I really had an opportunity to learn the art of soldiering without being thrust right into a conflict. 1987 came around, and I figured I would try out for this unit. I tried out for this unit on Fort Bragg. I was successful, and as a young staff sergeant, I was able to come to this unit at Fort Bragg and hone my skills as a special operations soldier. Almost immediately after getting to that unit, 1989 rolled around, and Just Cause happened. We were watching General Noriega in Panama, and the events that unfolded there, and it was the squadron I was assigned to that was tasked with capturing Manuel Noriega. There was a 2-squadron operation. One of them was to do a hostage rescue mission. The other one was to capture Manuel Noriega, and that was my squadron's mission. So barely 7 years in the Army, here I am with this premier special operations unit, really cutting my teeth for the first time in combat in a very unique situation. We had actually been able to do our rehearsals for the Panama invasion in Panama. That's kind of unique. And when we came back, the first Iraq War was starting to really bubble up. It was obvious that we were going to deploy a couple squadrons to Desert Storm, and because of our engagement in Panama, the command made the decision that our squadron would stay behind. The other 2 squadrons would go forward to Desert Storm. And that's when my chain of command said, hey, now is the time. If you want to go to the Q course and get your special forces qualification, now's the time to go, because all we're going to do here is sit on a pager unless something happens. So I asked to go to the Special Forces Medic course, and immediately my chain of command agreed. Back in the early 80s or mid 80s, at this point in time, we didn't have medics in each of the troops in each of the squadrons. There was one or two medics per squadron, and it just made sense to me that having another medic, having another guy with an aid bag in the operational force would be a wise thing to do. So I did. I left and I went to the Special Forces Medic course. That was a 15-month break because that's a fairly long course. It's one of the longest medic courses in our military. And I did that course and immediately came back. About the time I came back, early '90s, we were spinning up for a couple contingencies around the world, not the least of which was Mogadishu, Somalia. So I had come back as a new medic, kind of got re-blued in the squadron, back as an operator, but now having a little bit of an additional skill I could share with my teammates. And we prepared to go to Somalia and did all our rehearsals and eventually kicked that off in mid 1993. We headed off to Mogadishu. We were there for about 3 or 4 months, 2 to 3 months before the 3 October operation that has become famous in the media now had occurred. But up until that point in time, we had successfully conducted several operations that was having an effect on the power structure of Mohammed Farah Aidid and the powers to be that were really causing havoc in Mogadishu. And then, of course, 3 October happened, and we participated in the raid to go capture some of Mohammed Farah Aidid's key lieutenants. I was in that helicopter, the first helicopter, Super 61, that was shot down in that engagement. We were providing sniper coverage. At the time, I was a sniper. I had since left the assault troop and moved to the sniper troop. Um, and we were providing coverage for the assault force below when our aircraft got hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. And we had crashed. Fortunately, we were the first bird to crash because there was only one search and rescue team allocated to that event, and they came to our aid. There was a second helicopter that crashed, and unfortunately, there wasn't a force that was able to get to that bird in time to save anyone but the pilot. 1993 came and went. We had licked our wounds and come back from Mogadishu, and subsequently participated in a couple other events that were occurring around the world, from Panama to Somalia to Haiti to the Balkans. We spent a considerable amount of time in Haiti and the Balkans. Very small force from the unit went to Haiti, and then some time in the former Yugoslavia. As my time as a team leader began to wane, I had to make a decision. I was pushing now 17 years time in service. A lot of water under the bridge. I had skipped that whole concept of going back to school up to this point in time, and I was literally on the verge of retirement. I was three years away from having to make that retirement decision. But because I had done my team leader time in that organization, you have a finite period of time to be a team leader. My team leader time was coming to an end, so I had to make a decision. And there was typically one of three places in the unit you went after your team leader time. And that set you up for the next level of authority or command or support in that building. But incidentally, that was also the same year that the Army physician assistant program was really hurting for folks because they had changed the policy a couple of years prior. Once upon a time, the military PA school was all about senior medics going to school to become PAs. But what the Army was hoping to do was capture some of those younger soldiers early on in their career and train them as PAs in hopes that they would stay as physician assistants. Well, just the opposite happened. They were getting young kids, literally, with 3 or 4 years' time in service to go to PA school. Many of them weren't graduating because they didn't have the discipline of the previously older soldiers. And then the ones that did graduate would do their 4 or 5 year commitment and then get out of the Army. So here were PAs that only had 8 or 9 years, when their commitment was over, and it was reasonable for them to make that decision to go make real money out in the outside world rather than be a PA in the Army. So anyway, our human resources guy came down to the team room one day as I was literally struggling with that decision what to do. And he said, "Hey, they dropped the time and service requirement for PAs, and you have all the requirements. I can submit a packet for you tomorrow. You just need a couple letters of recommendation." So that's really the end of my enlisted career. I went to my two former commanders who were now general officers, asked them both for letters of recommendation. They provided that for me. I submitted my packet, or our human resources team submitted my packet. And while I was getting an award for one event or another, the commanding general of JSOC at the time, a guy by the name of Gary Harrell, who we recently lost to glioblastoma, a brain cancer, was pinning my award on my chest, and he said, we're presenting this award for whatever Steve did, and he said, and we're going to be leaving Steve soon to go to PA school. And I said, "Hey, sir, I haven't heard. I don't know that that's actually a fact." And he said, "I have. You're going to PA school." So now I had to think, what do I do now? Right? I'm at the twilight of my career, and I'm going off to this two-year school, 26-month school, to start all over. And I was not married at the time, but I was engaged to my wife, and and I came home and talked to her, and she said, "Let's do it. Let's just give it a shot, right? See how it works out." So I went off to PA school. My PA class was a class of fairly senior non-commissioned officers. There were a couple of us E8s and E8 promotables, as I was in the class. I made sure I had spoken to all the right people to ensure that I could come back to Fort Bragg once I was done with PA school. And I did. I graduated from PA school, end of my enlisted career, beginning of my new officer career. I was commissioned in 2000, which would have been 17 years time in service.
So how was the experience compared to going to the 18 Delta course to PA school? Did that really prepare you for what you saw in PA school? Said, I already know all this stuff, or was there a bunch of new stuff?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, because the 18 Delta course was at Fort Sam Houston when I went to the 18 Delta course. So back in the late 80s, the schoolhouse was still in San Antonio. It is no longer. It's here at Fort Bragg. But the 18 Delta course in San Antonio was literally right across the street from the PA program, and all of our references said U.S. Army Physician Assistant Program on them. So literally all of our textbooks, all of our what we call GRGs, General Graphic References, or whatever they were from the PA school. So literally for 15 months, we did what appeared to be, in my mind, an abbreviated version of PA school. When I got to PA school, the one epiphany I had was, good God, how little I really knew as an 18 Delta, right? Thank God I never got any of those things wrong. We were really good at trauma medicine. Special Forces medics are really good at trauma care. They're not really good at medicine, right? So what PA school did for me was reinforce the trauma care, but made me a much better medical provider. I understood medicine a whole lot better. I had since finished my two undergraduate degrees, one of which was in chemistry. So yeah, the first semester of PA school is all your hard sciences: biochemistry, microbiology, biochemistry. I think I just said biochemistry. So the first semester, which is really meant to weed out those folks that don't need to be there, was actually a very easy semester for me.
So do you have any challenges in transitioning from that enlisted role, senior enlisted role, to now becoming a commissioned officer, really within, your within the medical community? How did that go?
Yeah, so I think one of the most enjoyable moments in PA school was sitting in the classroom one day, and there was a knock at the door, and the instructor asked someone to open the door, and they opened the door, and it was the command sergeant major of the Army Medical Department, the AMED Center and school, and he asked to speak to me. So I got up and I walked out of the classroom into the hallway, and he looked at me and threw his hands up in the air. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, I'm sorry, Sergeant Major, I don't understand the question. He held up a piece of paper. He goes, you're on the promotion list for E9. He said, you just made Sergeant Major. And I had OCS brass on at the time, right? They didn't know what to do with PA students at the time. We were once warrant officers, and now we were in this process of being commissioned. So they really didn't know what to do with us. So we wore OCS rank, Officer Candidate School rank, even though we never went to Officer Candidate School, right? And here's the Command Sergeant Major of the AMED Center in school telling me I just came out on the sergeant's major list, and I just kind of chuckle. I'm like, well, this. I never intended to be here, Sergeant Major, one way or another. This is a road that is really unplanned. So the neat thing about going from E8 promotable, and at the time we were commissioned as second lieutenants. PAs these days are commissioned as first lieutenants, but I had been to combat several times. I had combat patches. I had combat awards, which a lot of folks in the Army didn't have at that period of time. Most of the conflicts we had just discussed, Panama, Somalia, Haiti, the Balkans, those were special operations conflicts. The general purpose force, for the most part, was not involved in those conflicts. So it was the soft guys that had the awards and decorations. It was the soft guys that had the combat patches. So here I am, a second lieutenant, going to my first assignment with a Ranger tab, a Special Forces tab, a President's 100 tab, an Airborne tab, a CIB, a CMB, awards and decorations that lieutenants would never have. And the best part about it was I had made a reference to doing my homework before going to PA school. Um, as a acting platoon sergeant in the Ranger Battalion, as a staff sergeant, I got a new lieutenant in to be our platoon leader, a guy by the name of Mike Garrett. Now, I didn't know Mike Garrett at the time, but I knew Mike Garrett's dad. Mike Garrett's dad was the command sergeant major of the 24th Infantry Division, who was our parent organization before there was a Ranger regiment. And we had conducted some exercises where, as a corporal, I supported the Command Sergeant Major Garrett and his staff in opposing, as the oppositional force, the OP4, against his command headquarters. So I knew Lieutenant Garrett's dad. So Lieutenant Garrett comes to us, and he's our new platoon leader. And we worked together for a little while before I went off to selection. Well, fast forward, graduating from PA school, I'm a lieutenant. Lieutenant Colonel Garrett is now the battalion commander of a battalion in the 82nd Airborne Division, to which I'm assigned. So I literally went from being platoon leader, platoon sergeant together to being, he's a battalion commander, I'm his battalion PA, as a lieutenant, which was really pretty phenomenal. And that set the stage for where I went from there.
So one of the funny things that, in my career, I worked with a PA in the early 90s, and he was so mad when he had to go from being a warrant officer to becoming commissioned. What did you guys think about that? He's like, yeah. I don't want to be a major. I want to be chief.
Yeah. It's funny because it was in that period where there were still some pretty senior guys that would refer to us as chief, right? Even though we obviously had, commissioned officer rank on our collars. But I always consider that a term of respect. Our PA in the 1st Ranger Battalion, a guy by the name of Bill Donovan, Doc Donovan, is an absolute legend in the Ranger community and was always known as Chief Donovan. So I never thought I was big enough to fill those shoes, but I appreciated it as a term of endearment. I never thought of it as an inappropriate term. And I just the bottom line, Doug, is I had fun as a lieutenant because I wasn't learning. I mean, there was not much to learn at all in terms of soldiering, right? And my take, so that this was my first taste of the conventional military. I had spent my whole enlisted career in the 1st Ranger Battalion and the Army Special Missions Unit. I mean, literally the cream of the force. And here as a lieutenant, with now nearly 20 years time in service, I find myself going back to skill level 1. And what I discovered as a lieutenant in the 82nd is that the general purpose force by design is always skill level 1. They can't be anything other than skill level 1. They have privates that they're teaching how to be soldiers. They have team leaders and squad leaders and platoon leaders and company commanders that have never been that before. So they're all learning how to be that, right? So everything they do is really focused on skill level 1. To be a leader in the Ranger Regiment, you had to have had that leadership position in a conventional unit somewhere else. If you were a platoon leader in the Ranger Battalion, you had to be a platoon leader in the conventional force. If you were a company commander in the Ranger Battalion, you had to be a company commander in the conventional force. So even though it seemed like it was holding up your career, ultimately it was those guys that did that leadership position twice that helped them to ascend to the senior leadership positions in the military, but not so in the conventional force. So I just had fun teaching medics, really interacting with the soldiers, sharing with them what I had learned about soldiering, uh, combat medicine, how to take care of soldiers to prepare for and during and after and recovering from combat. Um, that really made my time as a lieutenant fun.
So you finish up PA school in 2000. What could possibly go wrong after 2000, right? So tell us your 9/11 story.
Yeah, so as much as I enjoyed being in the general purpose force, and as an enlisted guy, I only PCS'd once. I PCS'd once in 17 years. I went from the Ranger Battalion to the Special Missions Force, Special Missions Unit, and that was it. So I knew that there was ways to shelter in place, if you will. I knew that there were ways to manage your own career before Human Resources Command managed it for you. So I took advantage of the fact that I understood that in the conventional force, it was not uncommon to PCS folks every 2 to 3 years. As it became obvious that we were about to go to war in either Iraq or Afghanistan or both, um, I started making the rounds back in the special operations community and discovered that the 3rd Special Forces Group was short a PA, and that the 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Special Forces Group was the first battalion on the patch chart to go to Iraq. So I went and met with the 3rd Special Forces Group chain of command. Unannounced, I walked in the door one day and introduced myself to whoever would see me there at the 3rd Special Forces Group headquarters. I told them I was finishing up my 2nd year in the 82nd Airborne Division, and I understood that there was an opening in 3rd Group, specifically 3rd Battalion, 3rd Group, and I was Special Forces trained and Ranger trained and Airborne trained and Halo trained and Jump Master trained, et cetera, et cetera. And I really think you guys could use a guy like me in your battalion that's about to go to war. And it took about 30 seconds for whoever I was talking to get to the XO, who got to the commander, who called me into his office and called the battalion commander from 3rd Battalion, 3rd Special Forces Group up to the headquarters. And we literally met, and I was hired on the spot. And it was about 3 months later that we were on the ground in Iraq. So I never did get an opportunity to deploy with the conventional force, the general purpose force. That was not by design, but I did manage to get back on the battlefield as soon as I could. Now as a new PA and as a first lieutenant now.
So with your vast experience in multiple high intensity operations, both as an enlisted medic and now as a PA, what would you say is the most significant evolution in military medicine that you've seen over your time?
It's a fact that after every conflict, the military forgets some lessons, and it's hard to watch that over the decades. And I think the real enlightening moment for me was watching combat casualty care in Mogadishu. in what was a very disconnected, poorly managed, maybe there's not even a word for it, because it wasn't we had medics and we had docs, but there was never, it was just a hodgepodge of what you're supposed to do when someone was hurt. And Mogadishu really opened the aperture of how, when things go wrong, they go really wrong, and no contingency plan ever could really capture the essence of what you need to do to help your mates in a situation like that. And really, the bottom line from Mogadishu, the lessons learned from Mogadishu, came down to the man, the individual. This was a firefight of epic proportion that caused us to lose 18 warfighters, but 18 warfighters that were not very cohesive, not working together very well, although from the same organization, if you will, JSOC being the organization, that really came together when the chips were down to make things right. And it was the individual, it was the guy on the ground, it was the guy with a finger on a trigger that figured out how to make things happen, to save their buddies, to protect their force, and to ensure that friendly casualties were minimized. And we ultimately were able to save a lot of lives. We had a lot of wounded. A lot of folks were wounded. We lost 18, but we had a lot of wounded. The other side of that seesaw was very uneven. I mean, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of enemy fighters that were casualties that day because of the capability of the force when we did finally come together. And it was really smart people, guys like Bob Mabry, who was a special forces medic a couple of years before me, and Steve Anderson, and guys that had since become docs or PAs, that really pushed the chain of command to understand how poorly things were done in Mogadishu and how we really needed to do better. And that created really an avenue for the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care to evolve to what it is today, and the Joint Trauma System to really grow into what it is today, and capture lessons learned and ensure that the force doesn't forget those hard won lessons, those hard learned lessons from the battlefield. So I think the epiphany, the tipping point for me for military medicine, the greatest change, the greatest delta over time was Mogadishu. Now, we've made a lot of strides since Mogadishu, but that for me was the beginning of that education process.
So one of the things that you've done later in your career is focused on research in traumatic brain injuries. What was the pivotal moment that said, "Hey, this is what I'm interested in," and what have you discovered about how TBIs are approached in military medicine has changed since you've kind of gotten into it?
You know, the answer to that question is much like me trying to go to medical school and figuring I'm going to go get some money by joining the Army and getting the Army College Fund. The impetus for our traumatic brain injury program had literally nothing to do with TBI. Somewhere around 2001, 2002, I discovered that the Army had started dabbling in these computer-based neurocognitive assessment programs for traumatic brain injury. But my question to our command psychologists was, can computer-based neurocognitive assessment tools be used to predict success in selection? The unit's selection process is very arduous, long, and very expensive. It costs the Army a lot of money to send someone to the Special Missions Unit selection process. And my question was, can we do a simple computer-based neurocognitive assessment and determine whether a guy will succeed or fail? And the answer is yes. The answer we learned was yes, you can. But this was, again, in the early 2000s, and lo and behold, we got our first casualty back from Iraq that had a traumatic brain injury. And one of the docs came back, one of the psychologists came back to me and said, "Steve, you have baseline data on this guy. You have baseline neurocognitive data on this guy. Why don't we retest him and see if we can detect an anomaly from his TBI?" So we retested him, and lo and behold, there was an obvious decrement. At the time, there was no good way to use that data. So I was literally flying to DC, from Fort Bragg to DC, every time we had a patient with a head injury, so I could sit down with the head neuropsychologist, a doctor by the name of Deb Warden, and discuss each one of these cases with her. The problem, what we discovered very early on, was that these neurocognitive assessment tools were too insensitive for the force. Our guys, based on the selection process, were really pushing the limits of GT score and IQ, and they were blowing these neurocognitive assessment scores out of the water. So when they had a traumatic brain injury, at baseline they were scoring 96, 97%, but when they had a TBI they were still scoring 90 or 84, 85%. I go to DC and I asked Dr. Warden, I'm like, "Hey, what do I do with this guy?" And she said, "What do you want from me? This guy's scoring in the 85th percentile. He's better than 85% in the Army." And I said, "Yeah, but he can't see his front sight post clearly, and he's got double vision, and he can't hear right." And so it was obvious we needed to do something different, and that set us on a path to really start looking into what makes a good test for traumatic brain injury. And we initially reached out to the Pittsburgh Steelers, Steelers traumatic brain injury team. Had a great relationship with that team, learned a lot from them. But along the way, I had also met the team from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the Gefeller Traumatic Brain Injury Center. And I learned that there was a capability right up the road from Fort Bragg that could really help us design what we have frequently referred to as the better mousetrap. That eye-opening event of recognizing that, just because it's a test and a validated test doesn't necessarily mean it's the right test for your force. Led us to set out on this pathway to find a better solution for our guys, and that was the beginning of our TBI program.
So tell me a little bit more about this assessment and tracking tactical forces initiative. Is that kind of something that happened after that TBI initiative started?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, our initial test was a neurocognitive assessment tool, what was called an NCAT, neurocognitive assessment test. And what I discovered, again, completely ignorant to the traumatic brain injury arena, was that there were lots of NCATs out there, and the one the Army was using and the one we did the assessment for selection on was called the ANAM, the Automated Neurocognitive Assessment Matrix. And that's the test we discovered was way too insensitive for our population. So I started asking around, and I asked the Pittsburgh Steelers guys, "What do you do for a neurocognitive assessment test?" And they said, "Oh, we use this test called the Impact on the sidelines. We do it at the beginning of the season. And then if a guy gets a concussion, he comes to the sideline and he retakes the test. And we compare his post-injury test to his baseline test right there on the spot." And I thought, that's brilliant. You don't have to fly to DC to talk to Dr. Warden about every single test. Let's figure out what this impact is all about. And I discovered there were others. So what we did at the unit was we did a head-to-head comparison of the ANAM along with 3 or 4 other commercially available tests. And lo and behold, it seemed like the impact test that the Steelers team was using was actually the best one for our unit. And again, we had folks with traumatic brain injuries, and again, they did fairly well on that computer-based test. So when I went back and asked our partners, what are we missing? If we can't get a solid answer from a neurocognitive assessment test, what else do we need to be looking at? And the answer was pretty clear. There are multiple domains. There are many facets to a traumatic brain injury, and you're only looking at cognition. You need to look at lots of other things. You need to look at balance, smell, vision, etc. So we sat down with a panel of experts, and we decided that we were going to put together a concept of a very comprehensive test that looked at just about every domain that could be affected by traumatic brain injury. And when I took that information to our commander and I said, "We have a concept for a new way to test our guys in baseline and post-injury, and here are the costs of those tests," and I had laid them out by test and the cost for each test. And the commander looked at me and said, "Steve, what would it cost to do all of them?" And I about fell out of my chair because I had never thought that, that was a possibility. I thought it was going to be cost prohibitive. And I did the math real quick and I said, "Well, sir, it'd be, X amount of dollars." At the time, it was $1,100 a man. And he said, "Do it. I want to baseline every one of our guys on this program. I want to do it for 2 years. I want you to come back in 2 years and tell me what you've learned from baseline and post-injury assessment. Well, this was the heyday of traumatic brain injury in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I had lots of pre and post-injury data that I could bring back to the command. And that test, that program that incorporated all those different facets that looked at biomarkers and imaging and balance and hand-eye coordination, that became known as assessing and tracking tactical forces, or the ATAC, or attack forces program. And it really, again, Doug, it happened by accident. It was a learning curve with smart people willing to make the decision and spend the money along the way.
So after retiring from the Army, you now serve as executive director at the Fort Bragg Research Institute, a program that is with Geneva Foundation. What are some of the things that you're looking at, and what are the biggest challenges in medical research, especially amongst the special operations community, in that Fort Bragg area?
Yeah. First and foremost, I want to thank you for calling it the Fort Bragg Research Institute, because we were originally named the Fort Bragg Research Institute. And when Fort Bragg renamed itself Fort Liberty, to maintain that, cohesion with the fighting force, we renamed ourselves to the Fort Liberty Research Institute. And I don't know if you've seen the news recently. I suspect you have, that there is a hint that we are going back to renaming the installation Fort Bragg. And we are very excited that in the near future, hopefully, we will be able to rename ourselves back to our original name of the Fort Bragg Research Institute. So the Geneva Foundation's been around for 30 years. Geneva's been supporting preclinical and clinical investigation for the Department of Defense for medicine for 30 years. The primary mechanism for them putting together programs for the DoD is what's called investigator-initiated research. So there's a doc somewhere that's interested in studying something that will advance the science of his or her specialty. The ear, nose, and throat doc may want to know something about ear tubes or tonsillectomies. A better way to do something. The orthopedic surgeon may want to understand a better way to do knee surgeries or ACL grafts or whatever. And that's good information. That's solid information, and it does support, lessons learned for medicine writ large, especially when you're talking about trauma medicine, because no one does trauma medicine like the military. But but Geneva and the DoD came together in 2018 because there were some commanders on Fort Liberty that brought up the point that while investigator-initiated research is really good science, what we're missing is the opportunity to do research that really supports the warfighter. The Geneva Foundation formed the Fort Bragg Research Institute in 2018. I was still in uniform at the time, but attended the ribbon cutting ceremony, and I was on the panel that helped shape what the Fort Bragg Research Institute would do. What Geneva decided to do, with help of the folks at the Department of Clinical Investigation here at Womack Army Medical Center and the commands on Fort Bragg, FORSCOM, 18th Airborne Corps, JSOC, etc., was focus. The Fort Bragg Research Institute would focus on warfighting command-directed research rather than investigator-initiated research. So my responsibility to the Geneva Foundation is to meet with the warfighting commands on Fort Liberty on a regular basis and determine what their gaps, needs, and requirements are. And then we build those teams and find the funding to put those research projects together and provide not just an answer, not just a manuscript back to the warfighting command, which is what you get out of investigator-initiated research. You get an abstract or a journal publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. The problem is warfighting commanders don't read the New England Journal of Medicine, right? So what we are chartered to do is provide a tangible solution, a functional, tangible, warfighter-approved solution for those gaps, needs, and requirements for the warfighting commands in the Army.
So can you give me, the Institute hasn't been around super long, but 7 years. Can you give me an example of, one of those innovative solutions that really helped the warfighter practically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go right back to ATAC, or Attack Forces Initiative. So I am absolutely blessed. I had a wonderful military career, and now that I'm out of uniform, I'm still able to support the warfighter. And probably one of the proudest moments was when we were able to recapture the work that we did in ATAC Forces as the Fort Liberty Research Institute. So Geneva supported us while I was still in uniform doing that work. And when I became the director of the Fort Bragg Research Institute, Geneva said, "This is your program. Take it back." Right. So we're going to give this back to you. So we were able to help the Special Missions Force design a mid-career tune-up program that is known as the Evolution Program, or Evolution Protocol, whereby we pull entire teams off the line at mid-career, what we consider mid-career, which is about 15 years time in service, and do a head-to-toe evaluation of that team. Each individual on that team, a head-to-toe evaluation to include everything involved in ATAC, all the neurocognitive balance, gait, biomarkers, imaging, vision, and take and have a staff and a functioning team that can help those soldiers who have been involved in nonstop combat for the last 10 or 15 years step back, take a break, recover, and get some care for those compounded injuries that have built up over time, that plaque that has literally built up in their psyche and their physical body over time, reset them and get them back on the battlefield. So I would say that is number one, the most appealing, or the thing I am most proud of being a part of is being able to help those warfighters kind of hit that reset button. So when they do get to the end of their career, it's not 20 years or 30 years of built up, injury and just scar tissue. They had an opportunity to reset. The second part is about a year into my taking the program back, SOCOM came back to us and said, "We now have enough money to put in the pot so that you can involve more than just the Army Special Missions Unit. We want you to bring other organizations into the fold. We want you to start doing ATAC and Evo Pro for other forces." And we're in the process of doing that right now. We're in the process of recruiting other special operations units and even conventional units into the traumatic brain injury program we've built over the last 23 years.
So going back to your clinical role as a medic, as a PA, and multiple deployments, is there a specific case or just a remarkable, in your mind, when you think of this was just an amazing clinical scenario that I was involved in, that you want to tell us about?
Probably the scariest moment and the proudest moment of my medical career would have been an operation in Al Qaim, Iraq. Um, Al Qaim is a little outpost on the western edge of Iraq. At the time, the mid 2000s, it was manned by a very small contingent of Marines, and there was lots of cross border operations going on, not from our side, but from the other side. There was a lot of influence moving into Iraq from other countries that were really causing havoc to coalition forces coming through that western border, not far from Al Qaim, as a matter of fact, through the town of Al Qaim. We had deployed a small force out to Al Qaim to support the Marines in an operation where they were really going to go clean house in that town, a little village really of Al Qaim. And I brought a brand new medic with me, and we brought part of a surgical team. Now they already had a surgeon out there, and they had some medics. The Marines that were out there had a small contingent of medicine out there, a medical force, but we brought a little bit more robust surgical capability and a couple of additional providers. The first operation we did, we ended up with 25 casualties. If there was ever an example of a mass casualty scenario, which by definition is a number of casualties that overwhelms the medical capability, um, in my career, Al Qaim would have had to have been it. The saving grace of that operation was the medical planning that went into moving that force forward to support the Marines. This was lots of lessons learned, not the least of which came from Somalia, previous fights, and previous battles in Iraq. We had been in Iraq for a couple of years now. We knew that there was a potential for this to get ugly. So while we didn't have a lot of people, what we did have was the right resources. We had lots of evacuation aircraft, even though flight times were hours back to surgical care. We had additional surgeons, and we had moved a PA and a couple more medics out there to help. Even though the rate limiting step was surgery at Al Qaim, what we were able to do in that one night battle with 25 casualties was work very effectively through 25 casualties and a couple killed in action, to get the folks at least stabilized, to get the warfighters stabilized. While we did run out of some supplies, and the surgeons at times were very overwhelmed and did operate for many hours on end, it was the ability to evac those casualties in shuttles as they were stabilized by the surgeons, load them on aircraft, and get them out of there back to a more capable surgical facility that really helped solidify in my mind the need for medical contingency planning. You never know what you're going to encounter, and if the size of your force is not adequate for what you think you're going to end up with in terms of casualties, the resources backing you up have to be robust. I think I'll share one other. Back in my time with third group, so this would have been 2001, 2002. We were responsible for 5 outstations in Afghanistan. We had gone to Iraq, we had come home from Iraq, we reset, and we immediately deployed to Afghanistan. So in my 2 years with the 3rd Special Forces Group, I did a tour in Iraq and a tour in Afghanistan. Got to Afghanistan, and the footprint in Afghanistan was expanding rather rapidly. We were responsible for 5 outstations. Now, we didn't have adequate providers. We had medics. We had 18 Deltas. We had great 18 Deltas at the time. But our most remote station was an outstation called De Raoud. And De Raoud was kind of a Vietnam-style A camp or base camp out in the middle of the desert. And one day, the A team, the special forces team that was out there with their indigenous force, went on a patrol, and they were about an hour away from the compound when the compound got attacked, and they took some pretty heavy casualties. We had moved in, we had flown in from Kandahar. It was myself and another medic, and as we were approaching the fire base, which was still under attack, I noticed a guy in the middle of the fire base manning the mortar. And I recognized him as the medic. And I thought, okay, if the medic is manning the mortar, who's taking care of the casualties? But I knew there wasn't a sizable force in that fire base if the team and their indige were out on patrol. And what I discovered later was this medic had secured all the mortar rounds he could get, and he had just started free gunning. He was loading around, aiming it, moving the mortar, loading around, and he was just going 360 around that fire base with that mortar, dropping rounds as best he could because he didn't know where the attack was coming from. He saw us hovering, and he moved the gun so we could land. I moved into the clinic there. The team engineer, so there were only 2 guys left in the compound, Americans, the engineer and the medic was on the gun. The engineer was the guy in the clinic, and as soon as I walked in, he said, "Doc, am I glad to see you?" And he left. Right. So I had no handoff. There was about a 1/4 inch of blood on the ground. There were 7 guys laying on the floor, all indige. And I knew that it was about an hour flight back to Kandahar. So I had to secure all these guys. The bird had taken off, right, because it couldn't sit there. It would have been blown up, at least shot up. So I had a finite amount of time to secure all these guys and get them prepared for evacuation, and move them to the exit of the compound where we can get them back on the bird. And there was one casualty I remember who had been shot right under the right rib cage, and he had an exit wound right under his right scapula. which in my mind meant that this guy had to have a hole in a lung or a diaphragm or something. This guy was awake and happy and talking to me just fine. I mean, he was a little short of breath, but I checked his vital signs and I checked his vital signs again. I went to other casualties. I took care of them, got them ready to move. And I thought to myself, I've got to put a chest tube in this guy because he is going to collapse on me any minute now. But every time I came back to that guy and checked his vital signs, he was stable. And I thought there is something really odd going on with this cat. So we had got everybody situated. We had managed to get everybody situated, loaded on the bird, and I sat with that guy the whole hour flight back and just held his hand, and we just kind of smiled at each other. I didn't speak Pashto, he didn't speak English. We got to the combat surgical team in Kandahar, and as we were unloading the bird, I told the trauma surgeon there, who I had known very well, I said, "This is the guy that needs to go in first." And he said, "What are you talking about? He's conscious." I said, "Look at his wounds." Right. And he said, "Okay, let's go let's put this guy down and we'll cut him open." So we got him on a bed and the anesthesiologist knocked him out. In the meantime, we did triage on all the other folks, and the surgeon agreed that he probably had the most life-threatening injury. And when we cut this guy from stem to stern, what we had discovered was the bullet had transected his hepatic artery, the artery that fed his liver, which could have easily been a fatal wound. But it also collapsed his right lung. And what had happened was when that lung collapsed, his liver twisted on itself and moved up into his chest cavity and tamponaded itself off. He lost no blood. I mean, he lost a few cc's. But if I had put a chest tube in that guy and reinflated that chest, that guy would have surely died. So the lesson learned there, and I have reinforced this to every medic I've ever come across, is that vital signs exist for a reason. You monitor your vital signs. You understand your patient. If your patient's talking to you, he's probably doing okay. Huge lesson learned for me there. The guy ultimately lived. So did everyone else that we brought home that day.
Yeah, that's a great story. I'd hate to be, putting a chest tube into someone's liver that's, tamponading itself in the thorax.
Yeah.
So looking back at your various leadership roles, what would you consider the key attributes of an effective medical leader, especially in special operations?
Yeah, I learned very early on. I had actually gotten kicked out of the unit when I made lieutenant colonel because there was no room for an 05 in the unit. The only 05 slot in that unit is for the command surgeon, and the command surgeon was typically an 06. So I had held on as long as I could, but I had to move on. And there was an opening at USASOC, the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, for a deputy command surgeon. But it wouldn't be open for a while. So I took a job at the 18th Airborne Corps as the deputy command surgeon there. And I will tell you, I was only there about 10 months. It was the absolute worst job of my career because the focus at that command, which, by the way, is our premier warfighting conventional command in our Army, for medicine just didn't exist. It was a staff position that was manned by a surgeon that was more interested in accolades than function. And it was a real struggle to be able to get any work done that really affected the force. And that was very disheartening to me at the time. 10 months into that, I had an opportunity to move. The job at USASOC had come open, and I moved into the deputy surgeon slot at USASOC. What I discovered early on there was that decisions made in a vacuum were never very effective. So one of the things I started doing early on, and I ended up spending 5 years as the deputy surgeon in that unit, was spending as much time as I could in the team rooms. I wanted to know what the junior medics knew. I wanted to know what the senior medics knew. I wanted to know what the PAs and the surgeons, the command surgeons in those battalions were struggling with. And I wanted to support their needs rather than just decree what was going to occur in the organization. Making decisions in a vacuum without ensuring that there's warfighter approval is never a good thing. You can create anything you want to create, but by the time you hand it off to the warfighter, you better be ready for the answer, "We'll never use this," or "That's worthless." or that'll never work in this environment. So early on, I tried to ensure that all of the subordinates across the continuum of USASOC, and USASOC's a big beast. It's the Ranger Regiment, it's civil affairs, it's psychological operations, it's the special forces, right? So there's a lot of opportunity out there to get input from the fighting force, because the way the Rangers do combat casualty care and the way special forces medic do combat casualty care is very different. I learned very early on that you have to appreciate the plight of each of those individuals as they go through their job, as they go through their day, and they're required to conduct operations on the battlefield and provide medicine to the fighting force while they're in garrison and in combat, before you make those decisions and write those command directives that are going to affect the force.
So, looking at our current policies and doctrine, how would you rate the roles and capabilities of physician assistants in military medicine? Do we have them in the right places? Do they have the right training? Do they have the right capabilities? What could be better?
I've had the opportunity to interact with PAs that were formerly medics, PAs that were formerly officers, but not medics, because officers can go to PA school now, and then PAs that were formerly not medics. Like every skill in the military, like every MOS in the military, there's good, there's mediocre, and there's not so good. The folks that were good NCOs to begin with and productive soldiers to begin with are typically really good PAs. And they really get down in the dirt with their medics. They roll their sleeves up, they get out there, and they really work through the things that medics should be doing to become better healthcare providers. There are those that take the easy road and say, you know what, I'm the doc, I got medics to do the sick call. I'll go to command and staff and I'll go to the clinic every now and then, but you know what, the medics can handle sick call. And I think that's the wrong answer. I do think we have PAs in the right place. We now have PAs in very senior levels of our military. We have our first general officer, Bill Solis, is a PA, doing wonderful things out there. So I think PAs as a community have really gained that stature where you are appreciated as an instrumental part of the force. Once upon a time, I think we were really just looked on as capability expanders, force expanders. You know, the docs can't be everywhere. There aren't enough medics. So this putting this PA in the middle as kind of this conduit between the medic and the doc helps just kind of manage that continuum of care, whether it's sick call in garrison or combat casualty care on the battlefield. But I think the lessons learned coming out of 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan have really solidified PAs as the difference that can be made when applied appropriately between the medics that really at the junior level barely understand what's in their aid bag, to the physicians who are tasked with probably way too many things to be doing good medicine for their battalions or brigades as a staff officer. And an effective PA really manages that middle ground, helping the docs who are new to the Army, but they're senior officers, understand the Army. And those medics who have been in the Army a little bit of time understand medicine. So I really think PAs are the neat middle ground, that really comfortable middle ground to improve combat casualty care, improve garrison health care, take some of the burden off the physicians, but also provide some incentive for those medics to do better things as they move there and greater things, and maybe go to PA school or medical school as they progress through their careers.
Kind of expanding on that, how do you think that telemedicine has improved or changed how medics and PAs provide care in austere locations? And is the special operations community able to take advantage of that when they're, in bad places with not a lot of connectivity?
Yeah, so there are a lot of folks that don't understand the difference between conventional medicine and special operations medicine. It's very simple. Conventional medicine in the military has a continuum of care arrayed on the battlefield to support each echelon. Role one care are medics with aid bags out there with the fighting force. Someone gets hurt, they patch them up and they move them back to the PA. Sometimes there's a battalion surgeon, sometimes there's only a brigade surgeon, but that PA is somewhere in the middle. So the medic gets the patient to the PA does additional uh, resuscitation or stabilization care, gets them off to the doc, who then gets them on a bird to get them to their first surgical care, which is really where care on the battlefield occurs, is with that surgeon, that first interaction with the surgeon. The special operations community doesn't have that continuum of care behind them. A special forces medic is responsible for all three of those roles of care until they can get a casualty out. Very early on in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was no echelon of care behind us in the special operations community. And we relied heavily on a phone call. There was a gentleman at Brooke Army Medical Center, not far from where you are, that would take our calls 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and route it to the appropriate specialist when we had questions as special forces medics. And there were bizarre things happen on the battlefield, like torced hepatic arteries that you never even considered. But things that you might have learned in school or read about in your education, or maybe trained on at your clinical care sites, but never actually had to do by yourself. And having that person on the other end of the phone that could just say, "Steve, take a deep breath. Here's what we're going to do together," was very comforting. And we have come a long way. TATRIC, the telemedicine and advanced casualty care folks, have really come a long way in building that bridge between medic and specialty care provider. My concern is the next fight against a peer or near peer or large scale combat operations where that communications link may be disrupted and you may not have the opportunity to talk to someone via telemedicine. And I think the real answer is going to be in augmented reality or virtual reality, where via a headset or an AR display or some other type of apparatus, a medic can refresh on a procedure that they may be familiar with but not very comfortable with, like a fasciotomy or an open fracture or a tracheotomy or something that is truly a life-saving measure, but something they may not be very comfortable doing by themselves. And having that opportunity to connect without a link by virtue of discontinuous communications across the battlefield to review a procedure or be able to through augmented or virtual reality re-blue on that procedure and at least get you through the stabilization part of that procedure is going to be very important. But telemedicine is going to be a huge part of what we do next on the battlefield.
So, what advice would you give to a young PA or another medical personnel considering a career in military medicine?
Spend time with your seniors, spend time with your subordinates. Again, I think back to the conventional army, there are no physicians in the battalions. The brigade combat teams and now our forces arrayed a little bit differently with the division as a fighting force. But the first physician in garrison exists at the brigade level. So the PA is really the senior medical advisor to the battalion. And that PA needs to be visible. You need to be visible to your chain of command. You need to answer their questions as it pertains to medicine. And if you don't know the answer, go get the answer. Reach out to your superiors, your mentors, and figure out what the answer to your commander's question is. But you have to spend time with your medics as well. You have to be present. You have to show them, not just tell them, you have to show them what it means to be the next level of healthcare provision. You need to be present. You need to take what they're capable of doing to the next level, and you need to be able to mentor them to take that capability to the next level. And the same with your physician, as I mentioned earlier. That physician's new to the Army, and they've got now they're in an O6 command. They're in a brigade level command as a young captain. they don't really understand what the Army's all about. It's your job as someone that has been a soldier for a while to help them understand the Army. And that was my first job in the 82nd when I worked for Lieutenant Colonel Mike Garrett. Our brigade surgeon was a wonderful guy, and we're still in touch to this day. But Dan didn't know a thing about the Army. I mean, he did his medical school in the civilian world and decided, I got to pay off some loans here. I'm going to join the Army. Joined the Army and really had no clue what he was getting himself into. We laugh about some of our early engagements because Dan really didn't understand soldiering, and there was a whole lot Dan taught me about clinical medicine. I understood trauma medicine, being an 18 Delta previously, and yeah, I went to PA school. And I joke, I say, when I went to PA school, I became a really good 18 Delta. If I ever went to medical school, I'd probably be a pretty good PA. Right? There are a lot of things that you learn incrementally as you go through your career. And Dan was able to teach me a whole lot about clinical medicine that I didn't really appreciate from the textbook. And there was a whole lot about the Army I was able to teach Dan. And we had a wonderful battalion with Mike Garrett. Our medical team was untouchable in the division because we were out with our medics. Every week we had some kind of challenging exercise. And that I didn't go to war with them when they went to war in 2002. I had gone to war with Third Group at the time, but I had went and visited the battalion when they got back from Iraq, and I met with the battalion commander, and he shook my hand. He thanked me. He said, "Steve, I could not have been more proud of the medical team and the way they worked in Iraq and on our casualties." And I know that was a lot in part because of what you and Dan did to prepare them for war. By the way, while they were at war and I was at war with Third Group, I needed a physician. My physician had left, so I had called Dan and I stole Dan from the 82nd and brought him over to Third Group with us. So Dan and I continued our career together for a little bit of time, which irritated that battalion commander a little bit because I stole his physician from him. But
I'll
hey,
bet.
yeah.
So you were recently inducted into the inaugural Special Operations Forces Medical Hall of Honor in 2024. Congratulations. And, you had an extraordinary career spanning over 36 years. One of the things that I always like to ask folks is, tell me your why. Why did you wake up every morning and put that uniform on and say, I'm going to do the best I can to be in military medicine? Why'd you do it?
This might sound cliche, but it's very simple. It's the guy and the girl to my right and left. I enjoyed getting up every day and going to learn something from my subordinates, and I enjoyed every day going to share lessons learned with those that wanted to know how to be a better soldier, how to be a better healthcare provider. And really, I think it was a pretty one lopsided equation. I think I learned a whole lot more than I ever taught anybody because I had an opportunity to serve in absolutely the premier units in our military. I spent 31 of those 36 plus years in the Special Operations Command in absolutely the best units our military has to put on the field of battle. And being able to appreciate what that guy and girl to your left and right are capable of, and just trying to achieve at least some modicum of respectable effort that would be worthy of having me there with them, I think kept me going. I have had by far the best team leaders and the best team members that anyone could have in the military through 6 conflicts, 16 combat rotations, and 6 different conflicts. And every one of those conflicts was very different. Just Cause, Haiti, Somalia, the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others, the Philippines. We're all very different, right? So there's no such thing as what we did in the last conflict, right? It's every conflict is new. Every conflict requires learning, but learning while relying on the foundation that you built and watching those medics go out there and do great things and being able to put on your kit and put a magazine in your weapon, but realize that that's going on your back because your aid bag is out front, was really the thing that kept me going. And man, if it wasn't for the aches and pains, I'd broken my back twice in the military and knee surgeries and all kinds of other surgeries. And frankly, I think I'd still be there, Doug. I'm glad. I'm glad there are younger, healthier people doing that job now, and I'm absolutely honored to be able to continue to support the warfighting force in the way I do, and have that interaction with those medics, those docs, and those commanders every day on Fort Liberty is absolutely incredibly rewarding for me. So I'm very appreciative of everything that I've been afforded the opportunity to do and the accolades I've received. But really, it's all in honor to the men and women with whom I've served. I've learned way more from them than they'll ever learn from me.
Well, we've been speaking with retired Army Lieutenant Colonel PA Stephen DeLellis on WarDocs podcast. Steve, thanks again for sharing your experiences and insights with us, and thank you for your incredible service to our nation.
Doug, I appreciate what you do. You've put together some incredible podcasts. I've watched several of them. Some of my buddies, good friends, mentors, and some of my subordinates have been on your podcasts, and I think it's important. The word needs to be out there of what folks need to be focusing on, how they need to focus, how they need to take care of their subordinates and superiors alike. Thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to WarDocs. We sure hope you enjoyed it. WarDocs is a nonprofit organization supported by donations from listeners like you. Please follow and subscribe to our show on whatever platform you consume your podcasts, and rate and review this episode, and share the show with your contacts on social media. Find out more information about our show, our guests, and how to become a member of Team WarDocs on WarDocsPodcast.com. Thank you for your support. If you like war stories and medical drama, WarDocs has you covered. Spread the word.